Welcome to Last Minute Lecture. This free chapter overview is designed to help students review and understand key concepts. These summaries supplement, not replace, the original textbook and may not be redistributed or resold. For complete coverage, always consult the official text. Imagine a biological lottery where 2 million tickets are printed before you're even born.
Yeah, and you hold on to them for decades, locked in a vault. Yeah. But over your entire lifetime, only about 400 will ever actually be drawn.
Right, and the rest. They're just completely destroyed. Welcome to today's deep dive. Today we're exploring the staggering numbers, the cellular factories, and the hidden neurobiology behind female reproduction.
Exactly. We are pulling directly from Chapter 82 of the Guyton and Hall textbook of Medical Physiology, the 15th edition.
And our mission here is to take some of the densest, most intricate physiological mechanisms from this text and, break them wide open. We want to translate this into plain language, especially if you're a college student seeing medical physiology for the very first time.
It's a lot of material, but there is a really elegant logical chain to it, from the anatomy down to the hormonal commands, the bodily changes, and the master regulation loops.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Right.
Before we get into how the system works, we have to understand where it happens, right?
Yeah.
The anatomy.
Right. So if you look at figures 82.1 and 82.2 in the text, you can picture the central staging ground. You have the uterus in the center, and reaching out from the upper corners are the fallopian tubes.
And at the ends of those tubes are these open finger-like fringes called fimbriae.
Yeah, the fimbriated ends. And they continuously sweep over the surface of two small almond-shaped organs, the ovaries.
And the ovaries are the vault holding all those lottery tickets we mentioned, the ova or the eggs.
Exactly. But what's wild is that the journey of those eggs, which is called oogenesis, it actually begins in a completely different part of the body. Figure 82.3 shows this beautifully.
Wait, before birth?
Long before a female is even born. During early embryonic development, these primordial germ cells physically migrate. They travel all the way from the yolk sac into the outer surface of the developing ovary.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, and once they arrive, they become oocygonia. They divide rapidly, cluster together, and then surround themselves with a protective layer of spindle cells to become primordial follicles.
I mean, the timeline here is what's so hard to wrap your head around. A female infant is born with roughly 1 to 2 million of these primary oocytes already in her ovaries.
Right, but they're frozen in time. They start cell division, they enter a phase called prophase die, and then they just hit pause.
They just sit there in total suspended animation for over a decade, just waiting for puberty.
And while they sit there, the vault is constantly shrinking. By the time puberty begins, that starting pool of 2 million has dwindled down to about 300,000.
Just from waiting.
Yeah. And over the entire reproductive lifespan, so roughly from age 13 to 46, only 400 to 500 of those follicles will ever mature enough to expel an ovum.
Which is roughly, one single egg a month. 400 out of an original 2 million.
Yeah.
The sheer inefficiency of that is just wild to me.
It really is.
So what happens to the hundreds of thousands of follicles that don't make the cut?
They undergo a process called atresia. It's basically organized degeneration and death. They just dissolve and get reabsorbed by the ovary.
But for the 400 or so that do eventually ovulate, they're waiting for a very specific alarm clock to wake them up, right?
Yes. And that alarm clock is a 3-tiered hormonal command system. It's a chain of communication that starts up in the brain, drops down to the pituitary gland, and then finally hits the ovaries.
Okay, so tier 1 is a releasing hormone from the hypothalamus called GnRH.
Correct. And tier 2 are the hormones released by the anterior pituitary gland in response to that GnRH. So that's follicle-stimulating hormone, or FSH, and luteinizing hormone, LH.
And then tier 3 would be the ovarian hormones themselves, estrogen and progesterone.
Exactly. Now, if you look at figure 82.4, it maps the concentrations of these hormones in the blood over a standard 28-day cycle, and you see these vastly different behaviors.
The pituitary hormones and the ovarian hormones form these massive, sweeping waves, right?
Yeah, they roll slowly upward, then suddenly spike to these dramatic peaks before crashing back down. But GnRH, up at the very top of the command chain, operates on a totally different rhythm.
It doesn't do waves at all. It's more like a steady, rapid beat, like a biological metronome.
What's fascinating here is that it absolutely has to be a beat. The hypothalamus secretes GnRH in short, rapid bursts. On average, it's 1 pulse every 90 minutes.
And the text points out that this pulsatile rhythm is driven by a specialized group of neurons called candy-Y-kisspeptin neurons.
Right. And if you were to give GnRH as a continuous, steady stream instead of those pulses, the anterior pituitary would just quickly become desensitized.
It would just go deaf to the signal.
Exactly. It would stop producing FSH and LH entirely, and the whole reproductive system would shut down.
So a constant fire hose of hormones actually breaks the system. It needs that distinct pulse. Okay, so once the pituitary gets that pulsing signal and releases FSH and LH to the bloodstream, they travel down to the ovary and kick off the follicular phase.
Right, which we can see in figure 82.5. At the start of the monthly cycle, FSH levels rise just slightly, but that slight rise is like a starter pistol. It causes 6 to 12 of those waiting primary follicles to suddenly accelerate their growth.
And as those 6 to 12 follicles grow, it turns into this microscopic factory floor. This is one of the most elegant chemical handoffs in the body.
Absolutely. Figure 82.8 outlines this incredible teamwork between cell layers. The outer layer of the follicle, the ecophytes, starts producing androgens.
But the oocytes have a major problem, right? They lack an enzyme called aromatase.
Yeah, and aromatase is the exact tool you need to turn androgens into estrogen. So they build the first half of the product, but they can't finish it.
So what do?
The androgens just diffuse across the membrane into the inner layer, the granulosa cells. Now, the granulosa cells are bathed in FSH, which heavily stimulates their supply of aromatase.
So they take the raw androgens and convert them directly into estrogens, a perfect cellular assembly line.
It really is.
But this brings us back to the numbers game. We just said 6 to 12 follicles are racing to grow, building these factories, filling with fluid to create an antrum. Here's where it gets really interesting. Why does the body spend all this energy ramping up a dozen follicles, only to starve out all but one?
Well, it's basically a localized monopoly, driven by an intrinsic positive feedback loop. The fastest growing follicle in that group gets a head start, and it starts secreting massive amounts of estrogen.
And that estrogen travels back to the brain, right?
Exactly. It signals the pituitary to actually turn down the dial on FSH production.
Oh, so it literally pulls the ladder up behind it.
Completely. The smaller follicles don't have enough FSH receptors to survive that drop in hormone levels, so they stall out and undergo atresia.
But the largest follicle has developed so many of its own receptors that it can just keep growing despite the dropping FSH. It hoards all the available resources.
Right. And this ruthless competition acts as a built-in safeguard to ensure only one follicle reaches maturity each month, which prevents simultaneous multiple pregnancies.
Survival of the biggest. So now we have one massive mature follicle bulging on the surface of the ovary. But how does it actually escape the ovary?
It requires a massive hormonal trigger, the preovulatory LH surge. About 2 days before ovulation, luteinizing hormone levels just spike dramatically. Without this surge, the egg is trapped.
Figure 82.6 shows this. It's essentially a violent cellular jailbreak, isn't it?
That's a good way to put it. The outer wall of the follicle starts releasing proteolytic enzymes, which are like chemical scissors that dissolve and weaken the capsular wall.
And simultaneously, prostaglandins are secreted into the tissues.
Right, and those act as vasodilators. They draw blood plasma directly into the follicle, causing it to swell rapidly.
So the pressure is just building against that weakened wall.
Exactly. A small area in the center called the stigma protrudes outward. Fluid begins to ooze out, and then the follicle violently bursts. The ovum, along with its protective cells called the corona radiata, is physically expelled into the abdominal cavity.
And that's where those sweeping fimbriae of the fallopian tube catch it. But the ovary's job isn't done yet, is it? The ruptured follicle stays behind and transforms.
Yes. The leftover the setoca and granulosa cells undergo luteinization. They turn a bright yellowish color and become a brand new temporary pop-up organ called the corpus luteum.
And for the next 12 days, this corpus luteum is just a secretory powerhouse. It pumps out massive quantities of both progesterone and estrogen into the bloodstream before it eventually degenerates into scar tissue called the corpus albicans.
Right, and that systemic flood of hormones completely alters the environment of the rest of the body.
So let's talk about what those hormones actually do. Estrogen and progesterone are synthesized originally from cholesterol. For the estrogens, the heavy hitter is beta-estradiol.
Yeah, it's incredibly potent, 12 times stronger than estrone and 80 times stronger than estriol.
We can think of estrogen fundamentally as the builder, right? It promotes intense cellular proliferation.
Absolutely. Estrogen drives the growth of the uterus and external sex organs. It creates the ciliated cells in the fallopian tubes, develops the intricate duct systems in the breasts, and increases fat deposition in the thighs and buttocks.
It also strongly affects the skeleton by inhibiting osteoclastic activity, which promotes bone growth. But wait, if estrogen promotes bone growth, why do females generally stop growing taller a few years earlier than males do?
Because it builds bone a little too efficiently. Estrogen causes a rapid growth spurt at puberty, but it has this really strong unifying effect on the epiphyses, the growth plates of the long bones.
Oh, so it forces them to fuse.
Exactly. It forces them to fuse with the bone shafts much faster than testosterone does in males, and once those plates unite, bone lengthening stops permanently.
So the window for height just closes faster.
Yeah.
Okay, so if estrogen is the builder, then progesterone is the preparer.
Right. Its primary job is to promote secretory changes. It prepares the uterine lining for a fertilized egg to actually implant.
It also actively decreases uterine contraction so the uterus doesn't accidentally spasm and expel an implanted egg, right?
Yes, and it develops the secretory alveoli in the breasts, laying the groundwork for milk production.
So estrogen builds the scaffolding, and progesterone prepares the environment. Knowing that, we can decode the endometrial cycle, the 28-day cycle of the uterine lining, which is mapped out in figure 82.9.
Exactly. During the first half, before ovulation, estrogen drives the proliferative phase. The lining rapidly thickens, new blood vessels sprout, and cervical glands secrete a thin, stringy mucus.
And those microscopic strings actually align to guide sperm upward into the uterus.
Yeah. Then, after ovulation, the corpus luteum takes over, and we enter the secretory phase, driven heavily by progesterone.
The newly built lining swells, the blood vessels become super tortuous and twisted, and the glands secrete this nutrient-rich broth called uterine milk.
Which is perfectly formulated to nourish a dividing ovum before it implants.
But what if an egg never implants? After about 12 days, the corpus luteum dies, and the supply of estrogen and progesterone abruptly plummets.
And that sudden withdrawal is the trigger for menstruation. Those tortuous blood vessels undergo severe vasospasm. They clench down, cutting off their own blood flow.
And without blood, the built-up tissue becomes necrotic. It dies and separates from the uterine wall, and the desquamated tissue and blood are expelled.
This raises an important question, though. You're leaving a large, bleeding surface area inside the body for days. Why isn't there massive blood clotting or a catastrophic infection?
You'd think that would be incredibly dangerous.
The body anticipates it. The shedding tissue releases enormous amounts of an enzyme called fibrinolysin, which acts as a powerful clot buster. It breaks down blood clots before they can form.
So it keeps the fluid moving.
Exactly. And simultaneously, the tissue shedding triggers a massive flood of leukocytes, white blood cells, which makes the uterus highly resistant to infection during menstruation.
It is a brilliantly engineered defense. But how does the whole massive apparatus reset itself? We've tracked the local changes, but what rewinds the clock?
It comes down to systemic feedback loops, which you can see in figures 82.10, 11, and 12, specifically negative feedback.
So for most of the cycle, high levels of estrogen and progesterone tell the brain we have enough hormones, stop sending stimulation.
Right. It heavily suppresses the pituitary from secreting FSH and LH, and the corpus luteum helps by secreting a hormone called inhibin, which puts an extra brake on FSH.
And when the corpus luteum dies at the end of the month, that brake is suddenly lifted. Estrogen, progesterone, and inhibin plummet. The pituitary fires up FSH and LH again, and a new cycle begins.
But there is one glaring vital paradox here. We just established that high estrogen suppresses LH. Yet right before ovulation, when that dominant follicle is pumping out peak estrogen, it doesn't suppress LH.
Right, it does the exact opposite. It triggers a massive positive feedback spike.
Precisely. It's unique to this brief window. When estrogen exceeds a critical threshold for 2 to 3 days, the system flips from negative to positive feedback. The pituitary becomes highly sensitive and dumps massive amounts of LH.
The preovulatory LH surge.
Exactly. Without this paradoxical flip, the follicle would never rupture. Ovulation would be impossible.
It's wild that it requires runaway positive feedback just to function. So what does this all mean when we look at the whole system? If we trace it back to the brain, to those KNDI neurons in figure 82.11.
That's the engine room. Neurokinin B acts as the spark. Kisspeptin acts as the transmission, signaling the GnRH neurons to fire, and dynorphin acts as the brake to halt the pulse.
Fire, signal, halt. It's a perfectly timed neurological heartbeat for reproduction.
And because we understand that heartbeat, we can apply this physiology to major life stages. Like puberty, the infantile pituitary and ovaries are fully capable of functioning, they're just waiting on the brain to mature and flip the kisspeptin switch.
And on the other end is menopause, shown in figures 82.13 and 82.14. Around age 40 to 50, a woman simply runs out of primordial follicles. The lottery tickets are gone.
And when the follicles are gone, the ovaries can't produce estrogen. Without estrogen, there is zero negative feedback to the pituitary. The brake is permanently removed.
So FSH and LH levels just skyrocket, screaming at the ovaries to respond, but there are no follicles left.
Right. And the body has to readjust to a new baseline, leading to physiological changes like hot flushes, fatigue, and bone loss.
Which brings us to hormone replacement therapy, or HRT. From a mechanical standpoint, giving daily doses of estrogen artificially replaces that negative feedback.
But manipulating feedback loops carries risks. Based strictly on the clinical evidence in Guyton and Hall, administering estrogen and progestin can increase the risk for cardiovascular disease, blood clots, and breast cancer in some populations.
So it's a profound tool, but it requires balancing symptom relief against complex physiological risks. We also see these feedback loops manipulated in fertility control.
Yes. Natural fertility relies on a strict window. The ovum is viable for about 24 hours. Sperm can survive up to 5 days, so fertilization requires a very specific 4 to 5 day window.
And understanding that explains how oral contraceptives, the pill, work. They essentially hijack the brain's negative feedback loop.
Right. By providing a steady, artificial dose of synthetic estrogen and progestins, the pill keeps hormone levels stable. There's never a massive, sudden rise in natural estrogen.
And without that sharp rise, the positive feedback switch is never flipped. The pituitary never releases the LH surge, and ovulation is entirely blocked.
It's an incredible application of basic physiology. But sometimes the system blocks ovulation on its own, like in an ovulation, which is a common cause of sterility. The cycle churns along, but no egg is released.
And physicians can diagnose this using the physical properties of the hormones, right? Like the temperature spike in figure 82.15.
Yes, progesterone is thermogenic. In a normal cycle, body temperature abruptly spikes about 0.5 degree Fahrenheit exactly at ovulation because of the new supply of progesterone. If a patient tracks their temperature and never sees that mid-cycle spike, it's a strong clinical indicator of an anovulatory cycle.
To look back at the incredible logical chain we just traveled. We started with a dormant follicle, arrested for decades. We mapped how a tiny cluster of K and D neurons acts as a pacemaker.
Right, sending pulses to the pituitary, which releases FSH and LH, prompting that ruthless follicle competition.
The winner builds an estrogen factory, flips a paradoxical feedback switch, and violently ruptures to release an egg. The crater turns into a yellow pop-up organ pumping out progesterone before fading away to restart the clock.
Every localized change is exquisitely tethered to a master systemic feedback loop. Anatomy supports function, and function dictates the integrated system.
It really is a masterclass in biological engineering, and it leaves you with a profound thought. If this entire monthly cycle is fundamentally driven by that microscopic GnRH pulse generator in the brain, it makes you wonder how much of what we consider purely physical reproductive health is actually inextricably tied to the neurobiology of our brains.
It completely reframes how we view the boundary between the nervous system and the reproductive system.
It really does. From everyone here at the Last Minute Lecture team, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Whether you're prepping for a massive exam or just deeply curious about the machinery of the human body, good luck and keep that curiosity alive.